Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Davies. I work at HarperCollins Publishers, and I'm very excited to welcome everybody to our virtual event to celebrate the launch of Sittin' In, Jazz Clubs of the 1940s and 1950s by Jeff Gold, with this event moderated by Mark Ruffin and co-hosted by Arcana Books on the Arts. In Sittin' In, Grammy Award-winning music historian Jeff Gold presents a rare collection of more than 200 full-color and black and white souvenir photographs and memorabilia that bring to life the renowned jazz nightclubs of the 1940s and 50s. The book also features exclusive interviews with Quincy Jones, Sonny Rollins, Robin Given, Jason Moran, and Dan Morgenstern. The book has already received glowing praise. Sonny Rollins himself describes it as a great book and a story that needs to be told. Henry Rollins says that it's exquisite, and Herb Alpert describes it as fabulous, well thought out, beautifully put together, and artfully done with superb taste. A treasure. It's been featured in holiday gift guides in the LA Times and Wall Street Journal, and there's much more where that came from. Author Jeff Gold is a Grammy Award-winning music historian, archivist, author, and executive. Profiled by Rolling Stone as one of the 5 top collectors of high-end music memorabilia, Jeff is an internationally recognized expert who has consulted for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Museum of Pop Culture, and various record labels and cultural institutions. He's also appeared as a music memorabilia expert on PBS's History Detectives and V. Strong's Rock Collectors. We're thrilled to welcome Mark Ruffin as the moderator for today's event. This year marks 40 years of playing jazz on the radio for Ruffin, including 25 years on air in Chicago. He's a 2-time Emmy Award-winning television broadcaster and a Grammy nominee who's written over 600 magazine articles on jazz and American culture. Mark is the winner of both the Jazz Journalists Association Career Excellence in Broadcasting Award and the Duke Dubois Humanitarian Award from JazzWeek.com. In 2019, he was honored by Jazzmobile with their NYC Jazz Readers Award, and he's the author of the acclaimed Bebop Fairy Tales, published earlier this year, which we will link to in the chat. I'd like to thank Arcana Books on the Arts in the LA area for being the official bookseller for our virtual launch. Signed copies of Sittin' In are available for purchase from Arcana, and you can get your copy just by clicking on the link that you see on your screen, right where it says, buy your signed copy of Sittin' In. The last thing I'll note is that you can use Crowdcast's Q&A feature throughout the event to put in the questions for the audience Q&A that will follow Jeff and Mark's discussion, and you can also vote for the questions from other people that you'd most like to have answered. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jeff Gold and Mark Ruffin. Thanks to both of you for being here today.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick. Thank Arcana Books, too. What a great event, and what a great book, Jeff. First, congratulations, man.
Just thank you so much. Thanks for hosting this. I'm very appreciative. I've been listening on the radio for years.
Okay, Jeff, I've never seen a book like this. And, you know, there's so much to this book. It's jazz history, it's fashion history, it's civil rights history. There's so much to this book. But the first thing I have to ask is, how did it get started? Where did you find these pictures?
Well, so the people who know me know that every time I finish a book, I go, I'm never doing this again. It's way too much work. And I really have promised myself that this time. But I have this business buying and selling music collectibles called Record Mecca. And I got a call from somebody who I had met once before years earlier, who was a jazz collector. And I drove a few hours to his house, and he said, we're going to the bank. We went to his bank where his collection was stored. The most valuable stuff was stored in a series of safe deposit boxes. So we went to one of those little 5x5 rooms that they have at banks for safe deposit box stuff. And he disappeared and came back about 5 minutes later, rolling this cart with 5 huge safe deposit boxes. And the stuff he had was incredible, but it wasn't organized. It was kind of, he'd buy something, put it in the box, buy something else, put it in the box. So I was sorting through these things, putting to the side stuff I wanted to buy. And it would be, here's 10 photographs, here's some autographs, here's some handbills from shows, here's a folded up poster. Hey, what's this? Small's Paradise, very famous jazz club. Open it up, a photo of the patrons at Small's. I got to have that. I've never seen any of these. Boom. And so I'm going through these boxes for hours. I eventually went 3 times to his bank, and I pulled out over the 3 times about 150 of these. And even when I got to maybe the 30th one, I go, if I've spent my whole life dealing with music memorabilia and I've never seen one of these, they can't be that well known. And when I got to about number 30, I go, this is a book. But I just kept going, and I brought them home, and I engaged in this kind of staring contest with them. I had said I was never doing a book, but I'd never seen these. So I was Googling, and I couldn't find any of them anywhere. There weren't any books of them. In fact, there weren't any books on jazz clubs. And over about 6 months, I kind of stared these things down while they stared me down. And eventually I decided, you know what? I got to let these things loose. They need to be out in the culture. They're such an amazing document of the history of jazz. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, when you see pictures of Small's Paradise, you see pictures of the artists on stage playing, or the outside, or the marquee. But you never see pictures of who these people are who went to jazz shows. So these things kind of turn the camera around. That's the genesis.
You know, Jeff, those pictures make it a great coffee table book, you know, but there's also so much history. And I know about your other two books. It seems like this book would have been easier than those other two books. Your other book was 101 Essential Rock Records, the golden age of vinyl, from the Beatles to the Sex Pistols and Total Chaos. And then the story of the Stooges as told by Iggy Pop. Those books sound like hard work. Okay.
They were hard work.
Okay. So was this book easier to do?
No, this book was very hard work too. And part of the reason is because there are no books on jazz clubs. So I read or skimmed 40 books to do this book and spent a lot of time on the internet. But some of these clubs were open for 2 years in Cleveland. And really the only thing that exists is you can find contemporaneous ads or maybe a review in an African-American newspaper from Cleveland from the 40s, but that's it. So it was hard work.
Wow.
You know, because when I started this, I wasn't an expert on jazz clubs. I decided, you know, I need to talk to some people who are experts. So I thought about who that might be, and I decided I wanted to speak to some musicians and some people who were there. And so I was fortunate enough to land an interview with Quincy Jones, who started going to clubs in New York in the very early 50s.
Not to mention Seattle in the late 40s, but go ahead.
Exactly, yeah. Seattle in the late 40s and Boston. And then Sonny Rollins, who started sneaking into these clubs as a teenager in the late 40s, and he described how he would draw on a mustache with eyebrow pencil so nobody would hassle him about his age. And
there's also Robin Gibbon, who, you know, a jazz person doesn't know who that is. Who is Robin Gibbon and why is she there?
Robin Gibbon is the critic at large for the Washington Post, but she's the only fashion critic ever to win a Pulitzer Prize. And she is amazing at deconstructing photographs and looking at a photograph and teasing meaning out of it in a way that I would never be able to.
And the fourth person is Jason Moran, who is younger than me, so couldn't see many of these clubs. Why Jason?
He didn't go to any of these clubs, but Jason is a MacArthur Genius Grant-winning composer and pianist and visual artist and the creative director for jazz at the Kennedy Center. And I wanted to speak to a younger musician whose work is very influenced by history, which his is. And he has an expertise in jazz clubs. His visual art has been a recreation of the stages of some of these clubs in real size. And he's played with and collaborated with many older musicians. And so he had a really interesting, I wanted to see what a younger musician made of these. And he was blown away. He'd literally never seen one of these photos in his life. They blew his mind in the sense that he realized while he's documenting all of these aspects of his career, he's never documenting the audiences. And he talks about that at length in his interview.
Now, I would say I'm about 10 to 15 years older than Jason. And what we have in common is I've hung out with lots of great jazz musicians. And when I hear them, especially from my hometown of Chicago, when I hear them talk about jazz clubs, it's just like in a dream. What your book has done is open some of that up. And I'm sorry, I'm at the ocean. Your book has opened some of that up and have us experience what these clubs are like. But what I really like is not the musicians who are the focus. It's the audience that you feature mostly, right?
It is, and the fifth interview I did was with Dan Morgenstern, who's the preeminent jazz historian in the world. And he came to America as a refugee from Nazi Germany in 1947 and a jazz fanatic, and started hitting these clubs also as an underage teenager. So I felt like I had this kind of kaleidoscopic vision where I talked to two people who were there, Sonny and Quincy, on the stage. I talked to Dan, who was there in the audience. I talked to Jason, who's got a historical overview, and Robin, who can kind of tease meaning out of all these things, like I said. So I feel, and one of the things that dawned on me as I was doing this was to have been in a jazz club in the late 40s, even as an 18-year-old, you're 90 or older, which is what Sonny and Dan are, and Quincy's 87. And I thought, in 10 or 15 years, it's going to be impossible to get a firsthand account of what these clubs were like. So I'm really glad I could nail down the history.
I, again, being a bit older than Jason, but not old enough to go into clubs in the 60s, I do remember that there were always a photographer around doing the hustle, trying to make a buck with the pictures, And I gather that's what you came across, a lot of what these photographers were doing.
Yeah. So a lot of these clubs had an in-house photographer. Dan said they were usually girls, and they would walk around from table to table and take a picture of you and your party, your girlfriend or your double date. And they'd take them in the back room, sometimes in a closet, and do a quickie developing job, and then offer them to you at the end of the night for $1 as a souvenir. And they're very ephemeral, but they're this incredible document of, it's mostly African Americans, but there are some with white people, there are some integrated. And one of the things, should we talk about that now?
No, go. You finish. I'm getting there. Go ahead.
So, Nick, can you show us picture number 2, the Charlie Parker with the couple? See if this tech works. Yes, no, maybe so. Well, there's a picture in the book of Charlie Parker.
There we
go. This is Charlie Parker at a New York City club called the Royal Roost, about 1948, posing with a couple. And I love the sly expression on his face. And I love the couple who are clearly have asked him to pose for this picture. And thanks, Nick. That's good. And so in my first interview with Quincy, I kind of offhandedly said, so what was the racial situation like in these clubs? And I didn't have an expectation for what he'd say. And he said, it was fantastic. Everybody got along great. All anybody cared about on stage was, could you play, mofo? And everybody in the audience got along great. And if people had paid attention to jazz musicians in the 50s, racism would have been done. And that just blew me away. I'd never heard anything like that. And that picture is kind of a good example of 1948. Here's an African-American guy who at that point is not the iconic Charlie Parker. He's a guy playing at a club who's well-respected, posing with this white couple. And I started thinking, when in the 1940s would you see that? And first off, it's kind of a primordial celebrity selfie, people walking down the street, trying to get a picture with somebody famous. I can't think of any version of that would be earlier than this. And then you consider, this was the height of Jim Crow America, and you've got this African-American person and these white people posing together and clearly at the white people's behest, and they look thrilled, and he looks happy, which is something else that emerges, and we'll see in these pictures. Everybody looks so happy.
Well, jazz can make you happy. My book, the subtitle of my book is a historical fiction trilogy on jazz, intolerance, and baseball. Baseball and jazz did so much for interracial relationships in America, and jazz much more than baseball, right? And so I think that's what your book shows.
As you begin to, first off, I'm going to plug your book, which I think is excellent, and it's historical fiction, and it's called Bebop Fairy Tales, and there will be a link to it in the chat, available from Amazon. So, baseball is usually where people think about desegregation with Jackie Robinson. But Benny Goodman integrated his band in 1936. So that's 11 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. And because Benny Goodman was the king of swing at that time and a nationally dominant musical force, nobody could give him any shit about it. Even, some accounts said he could go play in the South with an integrated band because people were so desperate to book him that they just dealt with it. And, that is, once I spoke to Quincy, that became a through line in the book that I investigated. And so
it almost had to be, because if you look at the history of jazz started in New Orleans, St. Louis, Chicago, then went to New York. And when it got to New York, it exploded, right? And jazz is about being a quality musician, and the listeners have to have the same kind of mind. I love that your book starts in New York with all those great clubs, and with the history of the clubs in New York. Can you talk about some of those clubs, please?
Yeah, Mark, I don't know if everybody else can, but I can just see the corner of your face.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, there are all these things happening that are driving the evolution of jazz that have nothing to do with music. So jazz starts at Storyville, the red light district in New Orleans, at the turn of the 20th century. 1917, the U.S. enters World War I, and there are bases around New Orleans, and the new recruits are getting distracted by the alcohol and prostitution and drugs available at Storyville. So the government forces Storyville to close down. Bunch of musicians out of work. Where do they go? As part of the great migration of African Americans who are going to northern industrial centers for jobs, wartime jobs, Chicago becomes a hub of wartime manufacturing.
Okay, but you forgot St. Louis first. They followed the river.
They followed the river. A lot of them went to St. Louis, which was a wide open town where they basically ignored prohibition that comes later on. They just anything you wanted, you could get there. But lots of them go up to Chicago, and 1920 prohibition happens. But Al Capone is the godfather of Chicago. He's the main bootlegger in the country, and he's a huge jazz fan. So there are speakeasies with illegal liquor all over the place. Many of them owned or partially owned or controlled by Al Capone. And that becomes the second major jazz center. 1929, there's the violent gang warfare, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 1931, the government finally can put Al Capone in jail for income tax evasion. There's a wave of reform. The government closes down all these speakeasies in Chicago. So there's a big migration of the musicians from Chicago go to New York, which has become the media capital of the United States, the record company capital of the United States, and the broadcasting capital of the United States. So the third great jazz center becomes in New York. And most of it starts out in Harlem, which is the main African-American community. And there are three main clubs and a ballroom and an auditorium, which we can briefly cover. The Cotton Club is started in the 1923 by a guy named Oni Madden, who's a bootlegger. And they have a kind of unique and horrible legacy in that they were a completely racist club. They had only African-American performers, and they had dancers and singers and comedians and a big band, but they only allowed white people in. And they had really racist artwork. And Nick, maybe you can show us some of that. Number 3, Cotton Club folder. So the Cotton Club was kind of an odd phenomenon. There's some of that racist artwork they have. Thanks, Nick. And you can shift back, Nick, sorry. But there are a few pretty good things about the Cotton Club. They pay the performers very well, and they give early and very important breaks to some major people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. But maybe most important, they have a national radio wire. And weekly, there's a live radio broadcast from the Cotton Club. And radio has just really solidified as a national phenomenon. And we're in the Prohibition years, and people don't have that much money, so they're looking for free entertainment, and radio provides that. And so Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway, who at the time are kind of locally known, become nationally known figures because of this live radio broadcast. And that enables them to get very good record deals and sell records across the country and tour across the country, which would not have been available. So it was interesting. Sonny Rollins was saying, yeah, but you don't think they were doing that for any reason other than they thought it was a way to make money? And I said, absolutely not. But at the same time, Dan Morgenstern told me, and Jason Moran too, that a lot of people looked at it as, hey, you know, African-American musicians have been oppressed for so long. This is an opportunity to get incredible exposure and be paid well. We'll make that deal. Interestingly, though, the other main clubs in Harlem, and lots of little clubs, there were hundreds of them, were integrated as early as the 20s. And so Connie's Inn and Small's Paradise, which I just showed, were fully integrated clubs with mostly African-American musicians, but sometimes white musicians would play with them. And everybody got along. And the biggest dance hall was the Savoy Ballroom, which we've got some pictures of here. Why don't you show number 4 with Dizzy Gillespie, Nick? And so the Savoy was fully integrated and was for dancing and was the dominant place that a lot of dances were invented, and it was very competitive. And as some people say in the book, all anybody cared about was whether you could dance. So that's Dizzy Gillespie and his big band playing at the Savoy. And they had a double stage. You can sort of see it in the background, where one big band would play their set, and then another big band next to them would play their set immediately afterward. And so let's go to the number 5 photo.
And of course, the Savoy was so famous. It had its own song, Stomping at the Savoy, and its own logo, the Home of Happy Feet.
The Home of Happy Feet, yeah. And Chick Webb was another big-time band leader who played there. And he hired Ella Fitzgerald at age 17, who had just won the Apollo talent contest. And she was his vocalist there. So here's an integrated group. We don't know when this is from, 40s probably, at the Savoy. And, you know, I'm not used to seeing photos like that. And everybody looks happy. Nobody has a care in the world. Pretty extraordinary it was extraordinary to hear about it, but to actually see it, to me, adds a whole nother dimension to it. So in 1935, there are race riots in Harlem, and a lot of white people see it as dangerous to go up there at that point. So a lot of these clubs' businesses contract because a lot of the people who were coming, the white people were coming from Midtown and downtown. So some of these clubs are forced to close, and some of these clubs move downtown. And the highest concentration of them, the next hub in New York is on 52nd Street, in about a block and a half area. And Nick, can we see photo number 6?
It's very famous. I mean, so many clubs, so many iconic photos of that street, but very few photos inside.
Too.
Yes.
So here you can see the main block, and as you can see, there are loads of clubs on these streets, and people who didn't have a lot of money, like Dan Morgenstern, who was a kid, said he'd go to one, and the musicians would give him tips like never order a mixed drink, order a beer because it comes in an opaque bottle. And the bartender can't see how much you've drunk, so he isn't going to be hassling you to buy more drinks. And to give the bartender a quarter when you order the beer, and then he'll leave you alone. But other people would just go from club to club to club to club to club. And it was really astounding. You know, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Art Tatum, Count Basie might all be playing on the street in a given night. And let's go to photo number 7.
And it was so important that they did call it the street. That's how important it was.
The street, yeah. This is the interior of the Club Onyx, which was, a lot of these clubs would move around, and the Club Onyx had 4 different locations, all within that one block. But you get an idea for how some of these clubs were really small. And Billie Holiday played a 3-month residency at the Club Onyx, and you can see the stage at the far end. But, you know, maybe there were 75 people could fit in there, and they might have 3 sets during the night. So this really historic scene, when you start drilling down and seeing who the people were who were going there and how small these clubs are, it's really kind of remarkable to me.
And it was integrated still. I mean,
and it was integrated, absolutely.
Yes. Yep. You know, you talked about Al Capone a bit earlier. One of the most famous clubs in New York in the 40s was, of course, named after Charlie Parker, Birdland. And just like clubs in Chicago, Birdland had a gangster reputation. Very famous guy.
It's funny. Birdland was started, and the founding partner was Morris Levy, who was a record business guy who I actually had lunch with one time.
God, you're nice. A record business guy. That's what you call him.
And the word was always that Morris Levy was connected. My father-in-law, oddly, was very good friends with him in the record business.
Wow.
Not the connected business. And so he started this club called Birdland, and he was, for all of his foibles, a racially very progressive guy. And he had record labels, which were famous for not paying liberal royalties, but recorded a lot of black music. He was very close with Count Basie personally and was his record label. And he insisted that black people be treated very well at Birdland. Everybody was welcome. He booked black and white entertainers. And that became probably the most famous jazz club ever. And we've got a great picture here, number 9. And I was talking about how these things are kind of primordial selfies. So as I was in this bank waiting room, I found a Birdland photo, and I started looking at it, looked on the right and said, that's Marlon Brando. And in fact, it is. So this is two couples who were sitting next to Marlon Brando, I guess, and got him to pose for a photo with them. And it's documented that he was a frequent patron of Birdland, as were many other celebrities. And it was the place to go. And as Sonny Rollins told me, the place to play. It was very prestigious. And Sonny said, you know, he'd grown up in Harlem and lived in Harlem. And to go to a club like this and have white people tell him how great he was and ask him if he could pose for a photo with them and get Sonny's autograph was just something that took him a while to process, because he hadn't had any experiences like this. But he said these clubs were really an oasis from racism and paradise, and a paradisical place to be. And he really speaks long and eloquently in his interview about how this is where, as he said, this is where racism started to break down heavily. And it's not a story that's well known.
You know, man, there's so many famous pictures in Birdland with the performers, but here's one with the audience, in the audience. And, you know, I when I was reading this book, I thought, man, I mean, there's some folks old enough, they might recognize some people, you know, and I was just thinking the common person. But in the chat box, Tom Schnabel, the famous LA broadcaster,
Tom well.
Oh, man, he wonders if that's Dorothy Dandridge. And I'm going to tell you, man, my wife and I, we thought the guy on the far left is an actor too, we thought. So, you know, maybe it was more than just Marlon Brando there in this picture.
That would be great. I'm hoping that some people recognize people and write to me. We'll check it out, Tom.
That would be a gas, man, if folks can actually, because there's so many pictures. And you know, Jeff and I have had a conversation already. We were on 3 hours. We could go on and on. But and speaking of going on and on, because we have to leave New York, but man, I love your emphasis of New York. You even have a little map around where all the clubs were. You could see where the Royal Roost was and the Bop City was and Birdland in New York. I think that's a cool aspect. But
well, let me just stop for a second.
Okay.
I would give a shout out to my daughter Ella Gold, who designed those maps. Graphic artist, and a shout out to my daughter Cleo Gold, who was my main researcher on this.
Wow, man! Researching this must have just been a lot of fun. Okay, I mean, if you're a nerd who likes to research, okay. But again, another very cool feature of this book is not New York centric. I mean, almost the history of jazz and jazz club, you have to have a big part of New York. But man, there's this collector. Did he just look for clubs all over the United States?
I think anything he could find, he bought. And once I started to do the book, I started bringing in other things that I found. But I think he just had a voracious appetite for anything jazz related.
Nick, can you show picture number 1 now? This is the Club de Lisa in Chicago. Again, I hung out with so many musicians in Chicago, man. They would just talk about these famous clubs. And I've always had this vision of what the Club de Lisa was like. And here it is. You're giving it to me, man. Describe this and anything else about Chicago we want to talk about.
Well, I love this photo first because you get kind of everything. You get integration. On the left is one of the DeLisa brothers. There were 4 of them who owned this club. I've had a picture of them. This is clearly one of them, but I couldn't tell you which one. And 3 from the right is another white guy. I don't know if he's the club manager or part of their party or what. And that's one of the kind of interesting and engaging things about these. We don't know anything about 98% of who these people were, when they're from. We can date this particular one because it says buy war bonds. So it was sometime during World War II, during the early to mid 40s. But you also see the musicians, which is really rare. There's a guy with a stand-up bass standing behind the table. I love the hats. The woman second from the left is kind of cradling a bottle of liquor. There's just so much going on there. And the DeLisa was one of the prominent clubs in Chicago, had a good long run, was obviously fully integrated. They had illegal gambling downstairs, obviously lots of liquor. Must have been a very fun place.
Oh, man. And, and I went to Chicago. It's my hometown. So I skipped Atlantic City. That's something else about your book. Even jazz historians can learn how important Atlantic City was to jazz at the time. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Very much so. There's a club there called the Club Harlem that was one of the longest lived jazz clubs in the history. Started in the 30s and went on through the late 60s or early 70s. The movie Atlantic City with Burt Lancaster, there's a scene or a couple scenes shot in it. So that's kind of cool to be able to actually see the interior. It was huge. They had 3 separate showrooms, a number of bars, gambling. I think it accommodated 900 people in the various rooms. And we've got pictures of that, not today.
But you have quite a few pictures of it, actually. I mean, in relatively.
And again, fully integrated.
Yep. And then there's DC, man. Ramsey Lewis made a very famous record, gold record, top 10 in crowd, recorded at a club called the Bohemian Caverns. I just played a tune by a band called, I can't remember the name of the band, but they too recorded at the Bohemian Caverns. That's one of the most famous clubs in DC ever, right?
Yes, and it's one of the longest lived clubs ever. It started in the 20s in the basement of a drugstore, and at some point they changed the name to it started as the Crystal Caverns. And let's show picture number 10, which the owners of this decided they would create a cave, essentially. And so they brought in craftsmen from Italy to create these stalactites and stalagmites. This is a picture from the mid-40s. And as you can see, it was a cavern, a faux cavern. Thanks, Nick. And it went from the early 30s through the 80s, and then had another incarnation in the early 2000s. It just recently closed down for good a few years ago. And everything from Coltrane to Charlie Parker played there. It was a late night club. People would come and jam. During Prohibition, they would serve you setups. That's a big thing in these clubs. So Prohibition goes from 1920 to 1933. Liquor's illegal, but there are speakeasies all over the place, and lots of them have jazz entertainers. And so they would serve you teacups with lemon and some kind of mixer, and people would bring hip flasks with booze, or the waiters in different places would serve bootleg liquor. And that was a big place for that. And the guy who owned it said the only rule he had is if a musician came, you had to get on stage and play. So that must have been an amazing place.
Man, I can feel we're going to miss so much. There's so much we could talk about. But let's go, you not only talked about clubs and memorabilia from clubs, matches. I love the collage of just matchbooks from clubs. But also, like you said earlier, ballrooms and like Savoy and also the Apollo. Please put up picture number 11, I believe it is. Nick, is from the Turkish consulate, please tell them what that picture is about. It's amazing.
This is an amazing story.
Yes.
So in the 30s, a new ambassador to America is appointed by the Turkish government. And he had two sons, Ahmet Erdogan and Nesuhi Erdogan. And they were jazz and black music fanatics. So they moved to Washington, D.C. in 1932, something like that, and immediately start going to see African-American jazz performances and meet the performers. And because they're the sons of the Turkish ambassador, they start inviting these musicians over for Sunday brunch at the Turkish embassy and for jam sessions. And here you can see that is the Turkish embassy, and it's an integrated group of very famous musicians. I won't go through all their names, but they're in the book. And because this is the 1930s, some neighbors are aghast, and one senator calls the ambassador and demands that he stops letting these black people come in through the front door, and is essentially told to go to hell. And Ahmet and Nesuhi start booking shows, and because they're the Turkish ambassador's son, they have access to venues, and only after the shows are promoted do the organizers or the venues start finding out that these are integrated shows, but they can't close them down because these guys have too much juice. Of course, Ahmet Erdogan goes on to found Atlantic Records and become one of the most important record executives in the history of music. And his brother Nesuhi comes and joins him at some point, becomes an important producer, and they sign and make records with everybody from John Coltrane to Wilbur
Oh my
Harris.
gosh, we don't have time for their list. Oh my gosh.
So it all started at these jam sessions at the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C.
You know, just like the founders of Blue Note, Alfred Lyon and Wolf, I think Francis Wolf, when they came to America, man, they were shocked how black folks were treated with their own music, just like the Erdigans, right?
Very much so. And it was interesting to talk to Sonny Rollins about that, who recorded for Blue Note, which was owned by those guys, and recorded by Alfred Lyon. And he said, look, we were all in this together to promote this music. And Alfred Lyon, founder of Blue Note, was so aghast at how black people were treated, and really treated his artists very, very well, as did Bob Weinstock from Prestige, Sonny's earlier label. And he said, race just didn't come into it because we were in this battle to get this music exposed, and that's all anybody cared about.
Yeah, man. Like I said, man, there's so much we could get to. One of my favorite things, and Jeff knows this, is Detroit. and there's so many famous clubs that aren't in the book because you're restricted with what you could find, right? Exactly. I mean, if you think of Detroit, people be like, where's the Baby Grand? But on the other hand, man, there are a number of pictures, as we mentioned, where you got artists. You have an incredible picture from the Garfield Hotel. And another thing I love about the book, you give addresses. So anybody who were too young, you can imagine where these places were. But talk about that picture in the Garfield Hotel, because it's a lot of history there to me.
Well, let's go to that first photo of the Garfield, number 12. This is the Garfield was owned by an African-American. It was the first prestige hotel in Detroit owned by an African-American. Started in the 40s. And they had a jazz room called the Walha Room, which was the first letters of the owner and the manager's names. As you can see, it was a very deluxe kind of place. And let's go to the next photo, number 13. This is a photo of Dorothy Ashby, who's a very famous and well-regarded jazz harpist, playing at the Garfield, and it's dated 2/17/56. So oddly enough, I was born 2/8/56. So wow. I was 9 days old when that picture was taken, and that's the first time I thought of that. I did not get to go to that show. But I love how you can see the stage that we could see in the picture before in action. And there's a mirror behind Dorothy Ashby, so you can kind of see the bass player, a little, a double of him and Dorothy Ashby. And she is somebody who's very well regarded as a musician. And
but she hasn't been like to the general public. They don't know who she is.
What about collectors? Her records are really rare, being a record collector.
And not only that, she was on Prestige Records, Atlantic Records, Chess Records. I mean, the record executives knew.
Yeah,
I love that picture. And almost every Motown or chess record R&B tune you heard with a harp is Dorothy Ashby.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the race relation part of this, because I love the dichotomy of that there was a plantation club in St. Louis and there was a plantation club in LA, and they had totally different ideologies. Talk a bit about that.
Really interesting. I don't have any pictures of those set up, but they're in the book.
Yes.
In St. Louis, there's a club called the Club Plantation, and it is an extremely racist club. And they had advertising that said white patronage exclusively. I mean, it actually said it in the ads. And I saw some of that stuff, but obviously I didn't want to put it in my book. And there's a famous story about how Billy Eckstine's band was supposed to be playing there, and they were told, and Charlie Parker was in the band, and Dizzy Gillespie. And when they arrived, they were told they had to enter through the back door. And Billy Eckstine said, "To hell with that." And they went across town to play at another club. They just literally walked out. It was a gangster-owned club, and they didn't want any part of it. And one of the other major clubs, the Riviera in St. Louis, was set up kind of as an antidote to the Plantation Club. And they were fully integrated and had black and white musicians, black and white patrons. So most of the clubs around the country had some version of integration. The Plantation didn't, and well named. But oddly enough, in LA at the same time, there was a club Plantation, and that was owned by an African American, and it was in Watts. So obviously, calling your club Plantation didn't have the connotation back then everywhere that it does now.
The guy who owned it, his name was Joe Morris in LA. And you know, again, there's so much we could get to. We have to get to LA. Central Avenue was an amazing hub in LA. But you also, I mean, in addition to all the pictures, in addition to the history, you have some great notation and history about these clubs, whatever you could find. And then there's the famous Billy Berg Club in LA. Talk a bit about that.
All right, so we'll get to Central Avenue in a minute, but Billy Berg's was a club on Vine right by Sunset, and it was an integrated club. And in I'll do a little fast sidebar. So swing music is the dominant music in the land, and in 1943, the U.S. government decides, in an effort to raise money for World War II, they're going to slap a cabaret tax on places that play live music that have singers or dancing. And this is just one of many taxes that were slapped onto various things in order to raise money for the war effort. But that cabaret tax backfired in a big way because club owners had to raise their prices 30%. People were still in a post-depression wartime economy. And so fewer people go to the clubs. Clubs have to close down. These clubs that are paying for 20 people on stage in a big band because the scene is constricting. Some of the people have big bands, can't afford to keep them on the road anymore, and there are taxes on buses and gasoline and tires. So the big bands start to break up or shrink. And totally coincidentally, this other form of music is forming in Harlem at two venues called bebop. And bebop is kind of a reaction against swing music, which is very highly regimented and organized and charted. And the musicians might get a solo if you're the lead trombone, but probably you're just playing what's on the chart. So to blow off steam, these musicians start going to these clubs where they're jamming and playing music that's essentially all solos, no charts, totally off the head. And people don't dance to it, they listen to it. So as these clubs are starting to contract and these bands are starting to contract because of this wartime tax, somebody on 52nd Street realizes, hey, wait a minute. They don't dance to this and they don't have vocalists. So if we bring in a bebop band, we can skirt this cabaret tax. No dancers, no singers, no cabaret tax. And that supercharges bebop. That happens in about 1945.
Mm-hmm.
So also in 1945, Billy Berg's, the club we were talking about, books the Dizzy Gillespie Quintet for a 8-week stint. And at that point, Charlie Parker is the saxophone player, and it's an integrated band. They have Al Haig, who's white as a piano player, and Stan Levy, who's white as the drummer. So these guys come, and they are the first invasion of bebop to the West Coast. And it is greeted abysmally. critics and DJs don't understand this music. They want the old stuff. They're bad-mouthing it on the radio and bad-mouthing it in the press. People who come to the shows don't really understand what this is. And there's a small hardcore of fans who are really into it. But and in my book, I quote Bill Jackson, who's the famous Vibe player who's in that band. And he talks about, the audience might have been indifferent, but I was on stage. I just couldn't keep my eyes off Charlie Parker. This was some of the most intense music I'd ever seen. And I was ignoring them and focusing on Charlie Parker.
Well, that's the legend. The legend was that the audience hated it, but the players said it was some of the best bebop made.
Absolutely. And so we have a picture from Billy Berg's, which is number 15. And this is a great picture. Charlie Parker famously becomes, who is a heroin addict and an alcoholic, is staying on Central Avenue and meets a dealer called Moose the Mooch, who has a shoe shine stand. And Charlie Parker trades him record royalties for a supply of heroin. So he becomes much deeper, his addiction worsens, and he becomes much less reliable, doesn't show up some nights, though when he does, he's on fire by all accounts. And they bring in, Billy Berg insists he's paid for a quintet, so they have to bring in another saxophone player to be the sub when Charlie Parker doesn't show up. And that is Lucky Thompson, who is the gentleman pictured on the right here. And this is a souvenir photo from Billy Berg's. And as we see, the 3 or 4 guys on the left have military uniforms on. So it's very likely that this was from that famous engagement in 1945 where Lucky Thompson had to sub for Charlie Parker. And it's another example of it. He just looks delighted to be posing with these guys who look like they're having the time of their lives.
Yes, they're having big fun.
Over the second and third from the left, there's an African-American guy you can see and probably more. So once again, you can see the integration that you read about.
Great pictures from and memorabilia from Central Avenue, the most important early hub of jazz in California, without question. The Club Alabama, the Downbeat Club, great pictures, man.
Yeah, so Central Avenue is runs from downtown to Watts and is the preeminent African-American district. In the 20s and 30s, there were these restrictive housing covenants that essentially prevented or white people enacted to keep the riffraff out of their neighborhoods. Or what they perceived as the riffraff. So there were African-American neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, and then these lily white neighborhoods. And the main African-American neighborhood in LA was Central Avenue. And this was this corridor of Black-owned businesses and clubs. And there was a very famous hotel called the Dunbar that was Black-owned and was the kind of prestige hotel for Black people in Los Angeles, or Black people coming to visit Los Angeles, and home away from home from Ellington and Billie Holiday and all kinds of people. And then literally next door was the biggest club on Central Avenue, Club Alabama, which is a very prestigious venue that all the top national acts played at. And we've got some pictures from there. Number 16 is the cover of the portfolio from the Club Alabama. And I just love the artwork on these things. All the pictures I've shown you have some version of this kind of cover on their portfolio. And the next photo we have, and the last photo we have, number 17, is some people at Club Alabama. And I just love this picture. And Robin Given had a field day deconstructing this. And you see that woman on the right? She's like Hollywood. I'm in Los Angeles and I'm glamorous. And when you look at the angle of her hand and how relaxed she is and that hats they're wearing, everybody just looks fabulous. So that's it for the photos.
Man, it's a shame we didn't have enough time or more room for photos. On very next section, you talk about clubs away from Central Avenue. There's a club called the Oasis Club where you found a photo that was taken by the patrons, but the patrons went and had the whole band sign their photo.
Yeah. Let's see if I can find that fast and I'll hold it up. It is a classic.
2:30.
2:30. Thank you. Okay. So I'm guessing this is like on a New Year's Eve, something like that. And that's the artwork from the Oasis, which I think is great. And yeah, Louis Armstrong and his band must have been playing that night, and he had them sign the inside. And I've got a number of those. But it's signed by Earl Father Hines, Arvell Shaw, Louis Armstrong, Cozy Cole, and Jack Teagarden, who were his
That's
band members.
amazing.
And then Scatman Crothers, who was a singer and dancer, must have been there that night.
Well, and man, we could, folks, if you know who Slim Galliard is, just his history in this book is just ridiculous. And before we turn it over, we got to talk about San Francisco, one of my favorite jazz historical eras. And again, I learned so much about your book, man, about how parts of San Francisco got black because of racism and clubs came in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Fillmore district was a historically Asian, Japanese American district. And in one of the many ugly periods of American history, when World War II broke out, Asian Americans were forcibly relocated to these internment camps. And a unfortunate side effect of that was they had to leave their houses and their businesses. And there was this resulting in a huge amount of real estate becoming available in the Fillmore district at discount prices. And so a lot of African Americans moved there, and that's how that became a prominent African American district. And they opened businesses and clubs. And the Fillmore became the center of black music in San Francisco. But in more Tony areas of San Francisco, there were hotels and ballrooms that would hire people like Ellington to play at them, but wouldn't permit him to stay there. So these musicians would play their shows and then go down to the Fillmore and play a second show or jam or sit in. And it was a segregated scene elsewhere. The Fillmore was integrated. And one of the famous clubs that I talk about is called Jimbo's Bop City.
Yes.
And, Jimbo Edwards was a used car salesman and entrepreneur who wanted to open a restaurant called Jimbo's Waffle House, or did. And some friends of his saw he had a big back room and asked him if they could start putting on shows there. And sure. And it became the premier after-hours destination. It was open from 2 to 6 in the morning. Musicians would come from their own gigs and jam. Everybody played there. Coltrane, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, on down. And they would have parties for musicians too. And so here's a picture of a party for Duke Ellington at Jimbo's. It says, "Welcome to the Duke, celebrating his 25th year in music." It was actually his 35th year in music, but his 25th year from when he moved to New York from Washington, D.C.
It is such a great picture, man. Yes. And the club, there's a line where you talk about the club's clientele was eclectic, with working class listening alongside celebrities like Joe Louis, Marilyn Monroe, Sammy Davis Jr., Jack Kerouac, and even a young Clint Eastwood. Just, man, and again,
we could go back in time, man. You and me.
Yes. I learned in my own hometown, Chicago, I've always heard musicians talk about the club Rum Boogie. Didn't know it was owned by Joe Louis until I read your book, It
was. It was also owned by a used car dealer and Joe Louis. And actually, we'll go to picture 14. I lied. We have one more. This is a postcard from the Rum Boogie that just says it all to me.
There's someone.
Oh, there we go. No, sorry. There's it. There it
Wow,
is.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Does that look like a fun place? And you can see the musicians on the bandstand in the very top of that.
Now, do we want to take questions?
I think
there's someone who thinks it's possible that Charlie Christian is in one of your pictures. That would be amazing.
What? When?
Stephen Martin is his guy. Is the guy. He said, "Is it
I
possible?"
know Stephen Martin.
Wow.
My wife, Stephen Martin, introduced me to Martin.
Did he really?
Yeah.
And how many years you been married?
35 years and 6 days.
Go Stephen Martin. He asked, is that possible? That's Charlie Christian on guitar. I don't know what picture it is. But then someone named Michael says that could be Charlie Christian. We got to find out, since you know him.
We'll go back to, tell us which photo that was if you guys remember.
Yes, that would be amazing.
That would be amazing.
Oh, wow. Oh, man. Some great comments.
I'm not looking, but I guess I should.
Yes. There's Jeff included the famous photo from the open door with Bird, Monk, Mingus, and Hayes. I don't remember that picture.
Yep.
But not.
Funny enough, the book is open to it, sitting on my desk.
Wow. Wow. So from the gig, which might include Jack Kerouac, you know, man, I kept hoping you would find just a normal human being finding someone to know. It seems like people are thinking there's celebrities in some of these pictures.
Well, I know Jack Kerouac did one gig at the Village Vanguard with J.J. Johnson, and it was a disaster. And I think he never did a nightclub gig after that, if I'm correct.
Okay, so we'll open up to questions.
Yeah, we have, guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm gonna put up a couple questions from the Ask a Question Q&A section that is still open for anybody who wants to. We have a few in there, but if anybody else has questions, feel free to use that for anything you'd like Jeff and Mark to discuss. So I don't know if this just popped up on your guys' screen, but we have a
Nick,
question from.
Why don't you just go ahead and ask the questions, Nick, and we can.
Sure. Yeah. So we have this question from Pete that says, for you, Jeff, did you discover any new revelations, stories, or memorabilia about Billie Holiday, his favorite jazz artist ever?
Wow. Yeah, there are actually 2 pictures of Billie Holiday in the book that I'm sure exist only in this book, and they're from souvenir photos of people literally taking a picture of Billie Holiday performing on stage. So yeah, and one of them was from the side, and I wasn't really sure, and then I stumbled upon some other photos from a different angle of her playing, and I could put it together.
And speaking of Billie Holiday, I mean, we have to tell the story about Billie in the club with I can't remember which club it was. You would know, and how a certain song came to be.
Strange Fruit. Okay.
Yes.
So yeah. Thanks for the prompt. So there's a club called Cafe Society.
There it is, right. Started
by a guy named Marvin Josephson, who was a shoe salesman and jazz fanatic. And he went on vacation to Prague and Berlin, and went to cabarets and was blown away by cabarets and decided, screw the shoe business, I'm going to start a cabaret in New York City. So he borrowed $6,000 and started a cabaret called Cafe Society. And he had the great good fortune to be friends with John Hammond, the impresario who discovered Billie Holiday, Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen.
The list is ridiculous, yes.
And John Hammond said, you got to open with Billie Holiday, this vocalist who was just in Basie's band and Artie Shaw's band. So he hires Billie Holiday to be the vocalist. And Cafe Society is the first truly integrated club in Midtown, and downtown, actually. And Barney Josephson is another one of these guys who insists that African Americans are treated as well as white people, and sometimes better. And soon after she opens, he gets a visit from a high school teacher named Abel Meerpole, who has written this song, Strange Fruit. He's a white guy, in reaction to pictures of a lynching. South Carolina, I think.
Marion, Indiana. Marion, Indiana is where it was.
So he thinks Billie Holiday should sing this song and brings it to her. And she's frightened about being a black person in the 30s singing a song about lynching in New York City. And he just has a vision for it and says, no, here's what we're going to do. It'll be your last song of each of your 3 sets. We'll turn all the lights off and there'll just be a pin spotlight on you. I'll instruct the servers to stop serving alcohol and food. And we'll just build the drama and you'll sing this song. And so she gave it a go. And in her autobiography, she says, first there was just dead silence when she finished. And then a single person started clapping. and then a few more, and then a few more, and eventually the whole place erupted in applause. And that becomes her signature song.
Wow. Okay. Speaking of a club owner doing something to bring some drama or make a point, let's go to our friend in Boston,
Yes.
George Wein. Man, George Wein. Oh my gosh, bless his heart. He's still around with us. The founder of the Newport Jazz Festival. Also had clubs in Boston, Storyville. Please tell the Sarah Vaughan story, please.
So Boston, though it's a hip intellectual center, is a Puritan city, and they still have in the 50s these blue laws to protect people from movies or radio or television or clubs that the powers that be, the conservative powers that be, deem inappropriate. And one of the laws says that all entertainment must stop at the ring of midnight on Saturday night, because Sunday is the Lord's Day. And they take it really seriously, and cops will come in and shut down things and fine owners. And George Wein, in his autobiography, tells this story about it. He's got this happening engagement with Sarah Vaughan, and the show's just going great, but it's running a little late. And he sees 3 Irish cops walk in. And he thinks, oh, Jesus. Pun intended. No one. And so he walks up to Sarah Vaughan, who's performing, and kind of motions her over. And says, listen, at the stroke of midnight, I want you to start singing the Lord's Prayer a cappella. And so it's getting closer and closer to midnight, and the cops are going closer and closer to the stage to try and to shut down the show. And it's midnight, and she stops the band and starts singing the Lord's Prayer. And these cops are so flummoxed, they just sit there and watch it, and eventually just turn around and walk away. And George Wein said, you know, I don't think these Irish Catholic cops could wrap their head around pulling somebody off stage who had just sung God in Heaven.
Any more questions, Nick?
Yeah, we have a few. Hold on, I'm just gonna scroll back. There was one. I'm just pulling the ones from the chat for now, and then we'll go back to the ones in the Ask a Question section. But here is one from Jean, who asked, hold on, who asked if there are any photos in the book from the Blue Note in Chicago, because
Yes.
her father was the owner of the club from 1945 to 1960.
Wow.
Great question. Please.
Let's see if I can find that quickly. Yeah, there's a great photo from it.
And
and
again,
a whole section on it.
Somebody from Chicago, like me, I mean, I did not know about the segregation thing, and that Blue Note was the first integrated club in downtown Chicago.
Oh.
That is the cover of the folder. And I love this photo.
Yeah.
This guy's got all the answers, it looks like.
Great
Well,
question.
I could oblige, Gene. I write about your dad.
Yes.
All right, we have a question from Tom, who's asking, hold on, I'm sorry. What was the hardest thing about writing this unusual book?
Everything is my flip answer. It was a lot of work. Some of these clubs, like I said, there was almost no information on, and we had to dig very deep. The whole thing was really, really hard, but I'm very happy with it.
Wow. Someone says, who's making the
This was
documentary?
4.5 or 5 years it took me.
Wow. Who's making the documentary, someone says?
You.
Oh. That he's talking to the person who asked the question, not me. Okay, but any more?
Okay. Yeah, we have a few more questions. Michael says, it's great to see this crowdcast. There are hundreds of jazz cafes in Tokyo inspired by iconic American jazz clubs, and even have the American memorabilia, flyers, leaflets, and album covers adorning their walls. Have you been to any of these hi-fi cafes in Tokyo, and what do you think of them?
I haven't been to any of the ones in Tokyo, but what he's talking about is there's this incredible phenomenon in Japan. It's starting in the United States. There are a couple in Los Angeles one of which my friend Zach Cowie built, where they have incredible bars with incredible audio systems and record collections where they play vintage vinyl. And I haven't been to Japan since this phenomenon kind of exploded there, but I know all about it, and there's some good websites about it. But there are some in Los Angeles, and I'm sure in other cities too.
Then we have a question from Brad, who says, "I love music, and as you know, of course, comic books." I suppose Brad is somebody you know.
Good friend. Hello, Brad.
Have you ever had any dealings with a famous jazz record collector and underground artist, Robert Crumb? I'm sure he drew some of these places and musical artists.
I haven't, but boy, am I a big fan since I knew Brad.
And then Lee from Arcana Books on the Arts, where you can remember to buy your copy just by clicking on the button below the video here. But he says, "This is such an important and amazing document. You and Mark have really given life and background to the images. I know some of these have now been acquired by the New York Public Library. In the context of your rare music memorabilia business, have you had any pangs about putting these rare items back out into the world, as opposed to keeping the archive you assembled after your initial purchase intact?"
No, I think the best thing you can possibly do with stuff like this is not break up an archive and make sure it goes to an institution. And so I sold about half of these things to the Schomburg Center of the New York Public Library, which is the biggest collection of African-American material in the world. 5 years ago, they had 10 million pieces. And my idea was I'd keep half of it so I could have exhibits in bookstores like Arcana when the book came out. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But at some point, I'll probably place most of the rest of this stuff at an institution, keeping the best for me. I want to thank Lee and Whitney from Arcana as well for staging this. Lee and I worked together at Rhino Records in the 70s, where Lee and our friend Nels Klein played jazz and I played rock. And so it must be incredibly ironic for them to see me writing a jazz book.
Nels Klein, is that who you said? Yeah. Wow. There's someone named Nancy Montori did this, man. She says she worked for Morris Levy. He owned a chain of record stores in Boston, and one stop called Cambridge. Yeah, and her gig was to fly back and forth to New York City to bring label people packages. Yes. Wait, and she says, yes, packages. Weird.
Now, this is even weirder because Nancy worked for me at Warner.
Wow.
And I didn't know that. So we now have Nancy as the direct connection between me and Morris Levy, as well as my late father-in-law. There's a little too close there. Nancy, we're going to have to talk about this. And much love.
We have a couple more questions still. David asked, what was the size of the typical 1950s clubs? Was about what we saw in some of those?
We saw a small one in that photograph of the Onyx, which must have been 75 people. Birdland was probably 200 or 300. I don't think many of them got much bigger than that, though. When you got to the Savoy, that could hold a substantial amount of people, or the Apollo held 1,500, but those were arenas or auditoriums or dance halls.
Then Robert Kraft asks, are there any pictures of Babs Gonzalez or Mez Mesro?
There's a picture of Mez Mesro, right?
No,
in the I could have sworn in the DC in the Turkish.
Oh yeah, you know what? I think you're right. I think he is in that photograph of the Turkish embassy.
Yeah, one of the greatest pot dealers of all time, Mez Mesro.
A fascinating white guy who willed himself to be black any way he could, it seems.
Is that the Robert Kraft musician who had producer and all that? Same guy? Oh, you don't know.
I'm not sure. This is
Robert can tell us.
Yeah, you can tell us in the chat. Anything from the Village Vanguard?
Yes, I have a Village Vanguard section. Yep. They didn't have a photographer that I could tell, but I have a really great matchbook cover from there and a photo of Miles there and the Coltrane albums that were recorded there. Hi, Robert Kraft.
Robert says, yes, it is.
Wow. Love this stuff. I love
reading all this stuff afterward.
the matchbook collage.
Let's see if I can find that fast because it's such a great matchbook.
Didn't you tell me?
There we go. There's actually a display of matchbooks at the end, which I think are great, but this is probably the best one. What
Very
kind
cool.
of fever dream that came out of, I don't know, but I love it.
And Ron asks, do you know of the Monroe Gallery in Santa Fe? Imagine they'd be interested in an exhibit.
I don't, but I know Ron, so we'll talk about it.
Sounds good.
Hi, Blake.
I think I see one more question. That's a good place to wrap it up. But if I'll leave it open for anybody, and if people put in questions here, Jeff will be able to see them after the fact. This is all being recorded, and their questions are being there'll be a record of those too. So Jeff will be able to answer those questions, and I think get back to you directly with anything that we might have missed.
Will emails be attached to those questions so I can respond to people?
They should.
Put your email address in there if you want an answer.
Yeah.
And
we'll send out a wrap-up email too. You can, and anything that I'd be happy to take anything forward to Jeff directly and put anybody in touch who would like to be.
I wanted to mention two things. One, there's a website for the book called sittin.com, SITTININ.com, no G. And you can see a bunch of photographs and layouts from the book. There's a whole description. There's some of the early reviews. And my friend Tom Beery, Grover, put together a fantastic Spotify and Apple Music playlist that you can listen to as a soundtrack for this. So people who want more info can check that out. And people who want to reach me, Record Mecca, RECORDMECCA is my business website, and you can send me an email through that.
And I would like to say two things before we finish too. First, to Mary out there, she says there's times she would like to find out more names in the Turkish embassy picture. All the names are there, which is how come I knew Mesmero was in the picture. Okay, I think Lester Young is in that picture. Oh, the bass player.
Let me see if I can find it quickly. Keep going, and I'll.
It's such a great picture. So it's a great question. The other thing I want to mention, I can't let go without pushing my book one more time. If you want to find out anything about my book, it's called Bebop Fairy Tales, an historical fiction trilogy on jazz, intolerance, and baseball. bebop.markruffin.com for more information.
Highly recommended. All right, here are the musicians. I'll read you the list.
Yes.
Rex Stewart, Harry Carney, Barney Bigard. Oh, that's a different photo. Sorry. Okay. J.C. Higginbotham, Art Hodes, Sidney DeParis, Lou McGarity, Red Allen, Lester Young. This is someone I don't know. Sadi Koylan, Nesui Erdogan, Mert Oliver, Ralph Hawkins, Ahmet Erdogan, and yes, you are correct, Mesmero.
There you go.
Excellent.
So the last question that I saw in here that seems like a good place to wrap up is somebody asks, what's your next book?
Nothing.
If you have one.
My next book is Hanging Out with My Wonderful Wife, Jody.
There we go.
I invite you all to make my next book.
All right. I think that that about wraps it up. I think unless you guys had anything.
No, I really want to thank Mark, who I've been listening to on the radio for a long time on SiriusXM Real Jazz, and plug him in his book. And Nick, thank you. And Lee and Whitney, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming.
And I want to thank you, Jeff and Mark and Lee and the whole team at Arcana. And remember to you can buy a signed copy of the book by clicking that link below. And thanks to everybody for spending your Sunday with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.